Welcome everyone to this Law Day special event. I am Trish Rifo. I'm a partner in the law firm of Snell and Wilmer in Phoenix, Arizona, and I have the privilege this year to serve as president of the American Bar Association. Thank you all for being here, and especially let me thank the ABA Division for Public Education and our truly world-class panelists, each one of whom has done their own part and more to advance equal justice under the rule of law. Nobody could have better articulated the reason we are here than President Biden did in his Law Day proclamation. He wrote, quote, "The theme of this year's Law Day, advancing the rule of law now, is particularly fitting at this moment in our nation's history. Recently, we were again called to recognize that democracy is precious and fragile." He went on to say, quote, "On this Law Day, USA, I urge my fellow Americans to join me in recommitting ourselves to promoting and advancing the rule of law and delivering freedom and equality for all," close quote. The rule of law provides a bedrock of consistency and fairness in our society during times of peace and times of war, during periods of calm and periods of crisis, during times of civil order and times of civil unrest. The rule of law is with us when we are both comfortable and secure, and when we are shocked by violence and injustice and demand change. Free societies rely on the rule of law to protect and expand rights, to advance justice for all, and to enact positive change, to secure the blessings of liberty for all. We do this at home, whether by providing pro bono legal services to the poor, by working for free and fair elections, or by advocating for causes that bend the arc of the moral universe toward justice. And we do this abroad, by helping emerging democracies develop fair and open systems of law and justice, and by bearing witness to and holding governments accountable for human rights abuses and other injustices. Ours is a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. I renewed my appreciation for this just last week when I served for 3 days on a jury in the United States District Court here in Phoenix. That experience reminded me just how much our rights and our liberties depend on all of us as citizens to support them. So thank you, every one of you, for being here to support Law Day and for your dedication to advancing the rule of law now and always. The American Bar Association appreciates your leadership in your communities to promote civic awareness through Law Day this year and every year. It's now my great honor to introduce this year's Law Day Chair, Will Gunn, who has devoted his career to advancing the legal profession's commitment to promoting access to justice for all under the rule of law. Will graduated from the United States Air Force Academy with military honors and is a cum laude graduate of the Harvard Law School. He was elected president of the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau, the nation's oldest student-run legal services organization. Will retired from the Air Force as a colonel in 2005 after serving as the first ever Chief Defense Counsel in the Defense Department's Office of Military Commissions, where he established an office to provide criminal defense representation for detainees at the Guantanamo prison camp. He previously served in the Obama administration as general counsel for the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs. He also served as a White House fellow during the George H.W. Bush administration. Will has held a number of leadership positions in the American Bar Association, including serving as chair of the ABA Commission on Youth at Risk. We are especially thrilled that Will was recently named to become the Vice President for Legal Affairs and General Counsel of the Legal Services Corporation, the federal agency that supports free legal assistance for low-income Americans. The rule of law, of course, demands that all litigants, regardless of their ability to pay, should have access to legal representation, and the ABA looks forward to working with Will in this important new role and the LSC to ensure equal justice under law. Will, you have done an extraordinary job as Law Day Chair, smartest appointment I've made. And thank you for that, and thank you for all that you do for our profession and for the public we serve.
Well, thanks so much, Trish. I want to publicly thank you for the opportunity you've given me to serve as Law Day Chair and for trusting me to explore this theme, which couldn't be more timely, of advancing the rule of law now. While Law Day is usually a single day or at most a week, we've been at it since early March and want to give you an opportunity, everyone, an opportunity to join us. In order to do so, you can go to lawday.org to access Law Day resources, and there's some great stuff there. The rule of law has long been a background issue for me. And when I was growing up, as being born in Alabama and then growing up in Florida during the civil rights era, I listened to speeches by Dr. King where he often used the rule of law as a backdrop for his remarks. But the rule of law was sort of in the background, but after the attacks of September 11th, 2001, I started to ponder the concept in earnest. My personal shift occurred several months after the attack, when my career took an unexpected shift. I was asked to interview to become the chief defense counsel in an office that was being created to handle military commissions, also known as military tribunals, for detainees who were being held in a prison at the Guantanamo Naval Base in Cuba. The purpose of the commissions was to hold detainees accountable if they were responsible for the actions of September 11th and for other terrorist acts. I was eventually selected for the position, which meant I had responsibility for organizing an office to defend detainees who were accused of being members of Al-Qaeda. By default, this meant that our clients were among the most unpopular that an American lawyer could possibly have. When I got the job, I was assigned an office on the Pentagon's ground floor, right next to the wedge where a jetliner had flown into the building on 9/11. Each day, I would pass by a plaque with some words that President George W. Bush had spoken on the evening of September 11th. The plaque read, "Terrorist attacks can shake the foundations of our biggest buildings, but they cannot touch the foundation of America." Not long after I started in the job, I visited the Guantanamo prison camp for the first time and discovered that the motto for the task force that had responsibility for guarding the prisoners was honor bound to defend freedom. Each time I passed by a lower ranking person at the camp, they would render a salute and say in a loud voice, "Honor bound, sir." The plaque and the motto had a profound effect on me because, in my way of thinking, the foundation of America is the rule of law. And when the nation's founding documents talk about freedom, they were talking about an American system in which people would be given justice regardless of who they are. Now, I'm not naive. I recognize that when those words were spoken, we're talking about a nation that permitted slavery. But yet and still, those words, those concepts were baked into the system, baked into the American ideal. As a chief defense counsel, I was provided with a wide variety of challenges, including a lot of engagement with the media. One encounter really stands out in my memory was being interviewed by a BBC reporter for a show called Newsnight. I'd gone through media training and practice interviews, and I thought things were going well when I was asked a question by the reporter that I wasn't expecting. The reporter said something like, "Colonel Gunn, you've served your nation's military for many years, and now you find yourself being asked to defend alleged terrorists. Colonel, are you a patriot?" A lot of thoughts went through my mind, but I'll tell you, the question really threw me for a loop. And it was much later. I wish it was at that moment, but it was actually much later that I thought of the ideal response. And that response was rendered by Thomas Paine, widely considered to be among the founding thinkers of the American ideal. He said this: "He that would make his own liberty secure must guard even his enemy from oppression. For if he violates this duty, he establishes a precedent that will reach to himself. Times of conflict and controversy create intense pressure on the nation to actually live up to its ideals. This last year, in actuality, the last few years, have been times of great conflict and controversy in America. Our panel today, Access and Accountability, a Call to Action. We'll be examining what the rule of law means in this context, and hopefully we'll be talking about solutions. We're fortunate today to have Harvard Law School professor Randall Kennedy as our moderator. Now, I've known Professor Kennedy for more than 30 years. In fact, I was one of his first students at Harvard. So when someone suggested that we ask him to be a moderator, I was thrilled and reached out to him right away. And I was even more thrilled when he returned my call, actually returned my email with a call. You see, I had Professor Kennedy for a course called Race, Racism, and American Law, where we examined the rule of law back in the 1985-86 school year. And there haven't been many times in my academic career, in my life, where I rushed to get to class because I wanted to be there. But that was the nature of that class and the nature of Professor Kennedy, author of many books, Princeton grad, Yale Law School grad, Rhodes Scholar. What hasn't he done? What I'm thrilled about is that we have him today and that he's going to be serving as our moderator for our phenomenal panel. Professor Kennedy, over to you.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate your gracious introduction. And I'd like to say that, you know, I've been following your career now over the decades and have been admiring you from afar. I thought that your statement was a moving statement. And I definitely want to salute, and I use that word advisedly, salute the way in which you served your country when you were an officer at the Pentagon, tasked with defending people who were alleged to be enemies of the United States. So thank you very much. And I too look forward very much to this discussion. We're gonna start with everybody on the panel just introducing themselves, and I'll start off just quickly. My name is Randall Kennedy. I teach at Harvard Law School. I'm essentially a drill instructor for people who want to become lawyers. I teach contracts and I teach race relations law. Sometimes I teach criminal law. And I spend most of my time asking questions, which will be my function this evening. Montrese Ransom, why don't you tell us who you are and kick us off with an introduction of yourself? Thank you.
Sure, Professor Kennedy. Montrese McNeil Ransom here. I currently serve as the director of the National Coordinating Center for Public Health Training at the National Networks for Public Health Institutes. I spent 20 years at CDC in the public health law program. And a huge part of my job in that time was developing and delivering training on public health law to be delivered to public health practitioners. And so a lot of my time was spent really teaching civics, constitutional principles that underlie the work of public health. And one thing that I'll say that's relevant to our program today is that from where I sit, there is no public health in this country without the law, whether it's the establishment of a health department, which is done by statute, or the passing of the Clean Indoor Air Ordinance. It's the law, the rule of law, that creates the frameworks for healthy choices to be the norm in this country. So I'm honored to be here today, and I look forward to today's conversation.
Thank you. Ellen Rosenblum. I think you need to.
I need to unmute first.
Yes.
Hello, good afternoon or good evening, wherever you happen to be in the country. I am just honored to be in the company of this wonderful panel and of course, the chair of Law Day, our moderator and our president of the American Bar Association. I am currently serving as the Attorney General of the state of Oregon. So I am on afternoon time. I recently was elected to my third term. Previously, I served as a judge for over 20 years, first on the trial courts here in what's known as Multnomah County, Oregon, Portland. You've probably heard of that city before. And then I was on our intermediate appellate court, the Oregon Court of Appeals, after that. So I have a bit of a background in the rule of law, shall we say. And I'm very proud to have served on the Board of Governors of the American Bar Association under the first woman president of the ABA, Roberta Ramo. And it was that year during her term that the theme line of the ABA, Defending Liberty, Pursuing Justice, was adopted. And it has been 25 years and it is going strong. So I am very proud to have been a small part of the history of the ABA's involvement with the rule of law. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you. Juan Thomas.
Thank you, Professor Kennedy. It is such an honor and a privilege to be with you. I've been an admirer of yours for many years and have read so much of your writings and publications. And to my friend and colleague, Will Gunn, thank you for this invitation, and to all of my colleagues on this panel. It's truly humbling to be with all of you, and to our ABA president. It's always good to be in your presence again. My name is Juan Thomas. I'm an of-counsel partner at Quinteros, Prieto, Wood & Boyer in their Chicago office. We are the largest women minority-owned law firm in the country, and I'm honored to be there in the commercial real estate and labor and employment department in our Chicago office. I am also the vice chair of the American Bar Association section for Civil Rights and Social Justice. The ABA Civil Rights and Social Justice section is truly the conscience of the ABA, and I'm so honored to be part of that tremendous group of lawyers and staff who do all that we can to promote the agenda of the American Bar Association, and sometimes even push the American Bar Association when it needs to be pushed. And we do that in family and in fellowship with so many other lawyers across the country. I hail from Chicago. I'm a former local official here in the Chicago area. I was on the local school board for 5 years and had the honor of being the first African-American elected to the office of a township office in my hometown of Aurora, Illinois. And that's where I am from. And so I'm honored to be with all of you and look forward to this very important conversation. And just will say parenthetically, I've done a lot of this work advancing the rule of law, not only here in Illinois, but also in the context of local and state politics.
Thank you. Thank you. Eugene Volokh.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for having me. Very great pleasure to be on this. I'm just a law professor. I teach at UCLA Law School. I've been doing this for over 25 years now. Sobering thought to see one's career measured in multiple decades. But I mostly do First Amendment law. So I'm interested especially in rule of law as to speech, as to religion. I was born in 1968 in a country that had no rule of law to speak of. It had plenty of laws. They weren't usually followed. That's the Soviet Union. And I was 7 when I came to America. So what I know of the country of my birth came from my parents. But I learned a lot about the way the system there worked and how the rule of law was absent. And of course, after the revolutions thankfully mostly peaceful revolutions in Eastern Europe in the late 80s and early 90s, a lot of those countries tried to institute rule of law. Some, I think, succeeded pretty decently. Some, including my home country, whether it's Ukraine or Russia, depending on how you count it, maybe not so much. So it just shows how hard it is to have a rule of law, how important it is not to take it for granted to the extent you have it, and to advance it to the extent you can. Although, as I think we'll get to a little later, rule of law is a very good thing in many ways, but often we actually want less law and more discretion, more mercy, more case-by-case adjudication. So one important question, once you have a necessary quantity of rule of law, is when can you dispense with some to get some other things instead? So that's something that's long interested me.
Great. Well, we have a lot of questions on our docket. Let's start off with this one. What does rule of law mean to you? And Montrese, why don't we start with you? What does rule of law mean to you?
So, when I hear the words, I immediately, it reads patriarchal, dictatorial, if that's the right word. Mm-hmm. Because I truly believe that laws were meant to be written to protect the public good while balancing individual liberties. And the rule of law is critically important. There are studies that show that countries that have a rule of law in place and equitable ways of ensuring that laws are adhered to have better health outcomes. So it is critically important, but it's also important that these laws be applied equally.
Let me push a little. You began suggesting a rather negative view. You talked about rule of law. You said that immediately it connotes, I think, patriarchal, dictatorial.
Yes.
But then you ended with a positive. So clarify
on paper, this idea that we have rules in place that we all follow, that as Justice Harlan said in Jacobson v. Massachusetts, there are manifold restraints to which we're all necessarily subject to the common good. I get that. This language around the rule of law and how laws are applied inequitably, kind of living that, that's when I hear those words, it just feels a little patriarchal on paper, and this idea of the language I love, but we see that it's not being applied equally. And part of what I do in public health and what we do in public health law now is study the impact of laws. And I think we need to see more of that when it comes to the rule of law. What are the impact of laws that we have on the books? Because otherwise it does sound patriarchal. If you want me to keep going, there are many instances that the laws we see were written and are implemented and enforced by people who are far removed from the real application of those laws and the rule of law in real life. And so that's why I led with that sentence. It's important to kind of call that out from where I sit in my lived experiences.
Okay. Ellen, what does rule of law mean to you?
Well, I loved what Montrese said. And I want to start, this wasn't my plan, but I want to start by saying that by statute, I am the, quote, chief law officer of the state of Oregon. But I refer to myself as the people's attorney, and even sometimes as Mama Bear, because what I'm really all about is looking after the most vulnerable in my state and protecting them. And that's how I see my role most effectively as Attorney General. More formally, I believe the rule of law is the foundation of our democratic values and a real basis for the people's trust and confidence in the society we live in. So as we're evaluating and reimagining our approaches to society's injustices, consideration of the rule of law is an essential guide in our efforts.
You said that you view yourself as mama bear and you want to have a special, solicitude for the most vulnerable. What do you say to somebody who says, listen, I'm not amongst the most vulnerable. I realize that actually, as things turn out, I'm rather privileged, but before the bar of justice, before the bar of law, everybody should be treated the same. And you've just talked about how you look after some people more than others. What do you say to the person who says, what about treating everybody equally?
I absolutely agree. And we need to bring people up because everybody is not treated equally in our society, in our country. And so a big part of what I do is trying to level the playing field, level it for businesses, level it for consumers, level it for those who have less, and so that they can be on a par with those who have more. Maybe we can bring it down like that. So absolutely, I agree. I don't see anything inconsistent with that, and I'll take them on. I'll put on the gloves.
Okay. Juan, what does rule of law mean to you?
I really want to keep this real simple. The rule of law is simply the rules we all agree to play on, to live by. It's the policy. I'm a big NFL football buff, and the league is going to release their schedule this week. And I reference that simply for this reason. In the NFL, we all know the rules. You get 6 points when you score a touchdown. You get to kick an extra point for 1 point, or you can try to throw it in for 2 extra points. You don't get extra points if the quarterback is from Michigan versus Stanford. You don't get a first down based upon where you went to high school or how fast you run. The rules are clear. And here's another concept. They're transparent. Everybody can see them. And everybody is judged by the same standards. And what offends us in athletics is when we see players get away with things that the rules don't allow. When the referee misses a call, those fans are upset. Why? Because at the fundamental point of all of that is we're not applying the rules fairly. And so we live in a country, and my 2 colleagues before me touched on this, and Montrese was eloquent on this point. How we apply the rule of law is the issue. The law is patriarchal when we apply it one way for men and not women. And so I'll end with this point. There was a time in our country where women were not allowed to vote. That was the rule of law. Mm-hmm. Were women supposed to accept that forever? Thank God Ida B. Wells and Susan B. Anthony and a host of other sheroes and heroes said no. So the rule of law is not in and of itself a concept that we ought to emulate. We have to analyze how are these laws being applied and implemented to the people that they're supposed to protect.
Juan, you began your comments by talking about how we all agree. Now, there are a whole bunch of things, there are a whole bunch of laws with which I don't agree. And I suspect that, you could be a player in a league and not agree with some of the rules there. So how much is agreement part of the rule of law? Must one agree in order to be bound by the rules? Just suppose one disagrees.
Well, you've touched on an area that I'm quite passionate about. Just law versus unjust law. And Dr. King talks about that in great detail in his letter to a Birmingham jail. Unjust laws are laws that oppress, that separate, that keep people out, that denigrate humanity, to paraphrase Dr. King. Dr. King quotes St. Augustine when he says, an unjust law is no law at all. And so the first question is the law just? If you don't agree with the law and it's unjust, then you have to work to change that law. And that gets into the political and cultural dynamics of our society. But that's what people who are particularly privileged have done throughout history. What they have done is when they don't like something, they've changed the law. And what I have discovered and what I argue is that when people who have been historically oppressed learn the game and engage the process and change it to make it more fair and equitable, there's always a movement to move the goalposts, to stay in my sports analogy. Now that all these people are voting, let's make it harder to vote now. Well, it was fine a few years ago, but now that you don't like the result, you want to change the rules of the game. And so we have to be very careful about what's the underlying motivation behind those who want to move the goalpost and change the law.
Thank you. Eugene Volokh, what does rule of law mean to you?
Well, so the rule of law to me is that laws, whether good laws or bad laws, apply equally to people regardless of whether judges or jurors or police officers or other government officials like them. I think we've already seen that mentioned, and I totally agree with that. So it's the opposite of rule by executive or judicial discretion. And then the question that I think arises in many situations is, are we willing to see even laws we disagree with? Maybe not laws that are obviously patently unjust, although presumably if there are laws, some people think they're just, maybe laws that are controversial, if we want to see them even-handedly administered. And if so, what's the best way of doing that? I was hoping I could, if this works out, share a screen. I got this. It's from not a government official. This is from somebody who's interested in the rules having to do with California concealed carry permits. So maybe he's mistaken, but it seems pretty consistent with what I've heard. So first, a big picture thing in about 40 states of the union, including, for example, Oregon, including Illinois, not including Massachusetts and California, and about 40 states of the union, any law-abiding adult basically can get a license to carry a gun concealed. And in some of them, you don't even need a license. But if you, in those, at the very least, if you're law-abiding, you can get a license. California is one of the states that's called a may issue state. And it leaves it up to each sheriff's department to make a decision about whether to issue licenses. So according to this map, about 37 counties, mostly rural ones, but not only. Sacramento is one, San Bernardino and Riverside, those are big, very populated counties. Basically, if you go to the sheriff and you ask for a license, the sheriff will give it to you unless you have a criminal record. Although maybe not if the sheriff really doesn't like you. In 3 counties, San Francisco, Marin, Santa Clara, apparently you get virtually no issue. Maybe if you've been getting death threats, you get it. In my own Los Angeles, you know, some employment-related risks, it's super discretionary. So one thing we see here is you have a situation where the law is in practice set by sheriffs. So San Bernardino, Sacramento County sheriffs think one thing, San Francisco and Santa Clara County sheriffs think another thing. Also, in some of those counties, the ones that are kind of yellow especially, and maybe the red ones as well, it's really case by sheriffs. It's very much a rule of individual discretion. Now, some people may say that's good. Some people may say they don't like concealed carry. Maybe they'd rather the whole state was deep red, that nobody except police officers could have guns to carry concealed. But at the very least, if we're not going to have that rule, we ought to have it be in sheriff's discretion, because the sheriff can figure out, are you a trustworthy person or not? So maybe that's better than rule of law. It's not rule of law, really, right? It's discretion. But one question is, should we surrender clear legal rules, whether on one side or another side, and instead have discretionary judgment? One other matter that comes up that I'm sure people who have done criminal law work on this call are familiar with is you have a very similar debate about whether you're going to have rule of law or rule of discretion as to sentencing, right? So the sentencing guidelines at the federal level, and many states as well, are all about trying to turn sentencing into rule of law, because the sense was there's too much discretion. Too easy for judges to say, I like you, I don't like you. Maybe because of your race, maybe because of your sex. The sense is sometimes that men were more likely to be sentenced harshly than women for the same offense, let's say. Or maybe just because I'm a tough judge and somebody else is not. So then instead, people put in the sentencing guidelines. People say, well, wait a minute. Now there are all of these important distinctions based on the particular personal attributes of each defendant that are being lost. So now people are trying to shift, at least in many situations, towards greater discretion. Some people are saying, let's have a rule of law, but let's have more lenient sentences or maybe harsher sentences. But that's another situation where it's an interesting question. Should we have more rule of law? Should we have less rule of law for that? So I think we can all agree for many things we really need to have rule of law. But some of the most interesting questions are, at what point do we say mercy, discretion, case-by-case judgment is something that's a better solution?
Okay.
I should say I'm very much on the law side. I'm not a big fan of discretion, and I'm sorry to say mercy too. I think it's better to try to channel it through law, but lots of people disagree.
Okay. Montrese, the title of our program alludes to the rule of law now. There is in the title of the program, now. That suggests that something has changed over time. Has something changed over time with respect to your perception of the rule of law, or your relationship to the rule of law, or frankly, your feelings about the rule of law? Has anything changed in the recent past that's made you, rethink these issues?
Personally, I've learned some things through the years that have made me rethink these issues. I've lived some things that have made me rethink these issues, but a lot has changed over the past 2 years, with the COVID-19 pandemic. From where I sit, there's this attack on public health and this idea of us infringing on civil liberties in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, and this idea that the work that we're doing in public health to try to protect population health is a bad thing, and that we're violating their rights, when in many instances, the reason we've got these rules in place, these laws in place, these authorities in place for public health officials are exactly for incidents like this, so that we can better protect the public's health, so that we can better protect individuals and individual liberties. I also think that one of the key things that's changed is we don't teach civics like we used to teach civics anymore. And so understanding some basic constitutional principles, even when we might need to advocate for changes in the law, we're not even getting some of that basic education in schools the way we should be anymore. And so when I'm teaching public health practitioners about public health law, it is really the basics. It is literally separation of state. It is literally, or separation of powers, distribution of power. Because there's this idea that we have these freedoms and that freedom is free, that there's no price that has to be paid or nothing that we have to give up in order to maintain those freedoms in this country. And so I think that the education around the rule of law needs to be improved. And certainly education on how we the people can be involved in the process of changing laws that don't work in the way that they should.
Okay. Ellen, same question. Anything changed in the last few years that prompts you to have a different stance toward the rule of law? You're muted.
Might just have to stay off mute now. It seems like just about everything's changed in the last year to 2 years, maybe even just the last year. It's been phenomenal. But more recently, from the big lie, I'll put that in quotes, to the insurrection, which happened to occur on my birthday, January 6th. I have a new appreciation for the vulnerabilities of the rule of law based upon these incidents that I think have really demonstrated a remarkable rejection of the rule of law by some people. So I think what we really need today is leaders who are going to stand up and advocate for the rule of law. We can't any longer just safely assume that people will accept the rule of law, because they don't. And we can't just say, oh, that's a bad thing. We have to do something about it, and we have to demonstrate why the rule of law is still important. And I don't want to take issue with any of my wonderful colleagues, but I will say that when it comes
Please do.
all right, well then I will, because Professor, when it comes to something like sentencing guidelines and the discretion of the courts, I consider that discretion to be part of the rule of law.
Mhm.
It's a question of whether the legislature, at least in our case, it's even the people, because we have ballot measures up the yin yang here in Oregon. So it's a question of what the law is, what the people or the legislature choose for the law to be. But there's a tremendous amount of discretion on the part of the judiciary that is within the law. And I think when it comes to sentencing, it's turning out that's a good thing. Having been a judge, I was a judge before mandatory sentencing, minimum sentencing, and after mandatory minimum sentencing. And I'll take the before any day, because it gave me the opportunity to actually find out about the individual person and not just check the box on prior history, nature of the crime, done. That turned out to be a pretty bad idea. And we're trying to change that here in Oregon.
Let me interrupt for a minute. That seemed to me a nice point. Eugene, what about it? Discretion is part of many, is part of the rule of law. What about that?
Well, certainly a law could call for discretion at various levels. Prosecutors have discretion, judges could have sentencing discretion, police officers could have discretion about whom to arrest. And again, maybe that's good, but I don't think we could say that's rule of law simply because it follows the law. Let's just imagine a scenario. It was the scenario for much of human history, which is there is a law. The king does whatever the king wants. That's the law. All the power is in the king. The power of justice, dispensing justice and mercy, is up to the king. The power of creating new edicts and of deciding whom to get arrested. Well, the king might be following the law, but we wouldn't say that's a rule of law. Likewise, you could imagine a situation, by the way, this used to be the case in ancient Rome. There was a position called dictator. They wouldn't see the word dictator to be a pejorative. It was actually a position. You could be appointed dictator for 6 months, and then you could run the country as you wanted, usually in times of immense threat, like an invasion or some such. And you wouldn't be, as I understand it, legally accountable for whatever you did during your time as dictator. That was a constitutional office there, but I don't think we describe it as involving the rule of law. We describe it as a legal rule that calls for perhaps a very necessary departure from rule of law. That, by the way, in some measure may be true. The way we fight wars, generally speaking, especially when it comes to domestic matters, is very legal rule oriented. But you could imagine a democracy saying, in a time of emergency, we really give the president or the prime minister immense power to control the whole country, because that's what it takes to keep the Nazis from successfully invading or something like that. You could imagine that would be maybe very good in many ways. It's not rule of law. And we can multiply these examples as well. So what I think is being pointed out here is that sometimes the law does call for discretionary judgment, for decisions about mercy, case-by-case decision-making. It may be good, but I do think that in many ways it's contrary to the rule of law model that one, for example, pointed out, where you don't expect the referee to say, I'm going to consider all the factors about all of these players. In fact, maybe that's the best example. The last thing you want a referee is to say, I'd normally give a 10-yard penalty for that. But this person really is of a sterling character, and he's done some immensely important things in the past. So I'm only going to give him a 3-yard penalty for that, right? That's not rule of law for football. It may be rule of mercy, but we don't want that in football. So likewise, I don't think it's rule of law in the true sense, even within the judicial system, even if it's legally authorized. It's a rule of discretion, and it may be good, but it's a departure, I think, from rule of law norms.
But isn't discretion limited? In fact, if, for instance, a judge, or for that matter, a prosecutor, goes beyond the bounds of sound discretion, then they're acting unlawfully, right? I mean, isn't discretion bounded?
Well, so you could imagine discretion that's tightly bounded, for example, under the sentencing guidelines regime that maybe we have now, but certainly we had before it was limited by the Supreme Court. You had some discretion, but you might say it's little enough that it's quite heavily bounded. Under the pre-guidelines regime, which as I understand at the federal level was basically sentencing that was up to the judge within, of course, the statutory maximum. The judge couldn't sentence you for beyond the statutory maximum. But within the statutory maximum, which is often pretty high, my understanding was extremely differential review by appellate courts. So that was a system that, again, may have been a good system, but it was a discretionary system. Likewise with prosecutorial discretion. My understanding is prosecutors in almost all states, if they choose not to prosecute, then that's unlimited, that's unreviewable. That's their power. And maybe it's good power, maybe not. But again, I think it's a departure in some measure from rule of law norms, even when the legal system expressly authorizes it.
Juan, has your stance toward this idea of rule of law undergone any sort of change in our recent past, given the extraordinary things that we have witnessed over the past few years?
You know, Professor Kennedy, at first glance, I would say yes, obviously, my stance has changed. But then because I try to be a student of history and I reflect upon the history of our country, I recognize that things have not changed at all. What has happened is that the struggle has become more sophisticated and more obvious because of technology and the use of technology. And so when the enslaved Africans were freed, there was resistance to their economic, social, educational advancement. Those were done by Black codes and Jim Crow laws, the complete destruction of communities that they were building. The entire Reconstruction area was very short-lived. In the 60s, there was resistance to the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act that was passed and signed by President Kennedy. In fact, he announced it very clearly that he felt that he had lost a generation of white Southerners from the Democratic Party. And what happened? There was white flight. They became Republicans, they left parts of the South, and we see how that is manifest today. And now we see this resistance because while the struggle has not changed, America has changed. America is no longer a predominantly Caucasian male country. We all have seen the statistics and we know the numbers. America is becoming a country of people of color, Black, Latino, Asian, white, but we live in a country where not far from now, not far too in the future, white Americans will be the minority. And there's a community of people in this country that are intentionally resisting that and fighting against that. And while they are not part of the Jim Crow era, they are Jim Crow Esquire. They are Jim Crow senator. They are Jim Crow congressman. They are Jim Crow businessman. And they are working very hard to not allow this country to move in the direction that is inevitable. They cannot stop it, but they can slow it down if we don't stay engaged. And so what's changed for me is simply this. And I kind of say this kind of tongue in cheek. Black men in America had a holiday the day Barack Obama became president. All of my African-American brothers across the country were on cloud nine that one of us had become president. Some of us rested on our laurels. We thought we become, remember this term, post-racial. Who uses that word anymore? But what we all learned was that that political victory was not an end to white supremacy, white privilege, and the struggles of this country. It was a step in the right direction, but we have a long, long, long way to go.
on this long, long, long way to go, are you optimistic about the future, and in particular the use of law? You're a lawyer. Are you optimistic about the idea of using the law to push America to a higher level? Or are you not optimistic? What are you?
Yeah, I'm probably neither, because I'm decided
Oh,
to
you
become.
can no. I'm not. No, you've got no. You
Gotta
can't
pick
say
one?
that you are neither. You are
Okay.
you're either one or you're the other, or you're leaning one way or another.
I'll say it this way: I'm optimistic if we stay persistent and engaged, because right after, and again, not to become too political, but right after my Morehouse brother got elected to the U.S. Senate in January, there was a riot on Capitol Hill, and right after that, Georgia passes laws to make it harder for people to vote for Senator Warnock in 2022. That's also happening in Texas and Florida and other parts of the country. And so my optimism is tempered by our willingness to stay engaged in the struggle, because those who are on the other side of this struggle are not going to stop. They are relentless. They plot and plan while we're sleeping. And so my optimism is tempered by that reality.
Okay. Eugene, has your attitude toward the rule of law, the idea of the rule of law, has it changed in the recent past because of the events of the recent past?
I don't think it has. I think there are always new things happening, but I think the big picture questions are pretty similar. I think we have a continuing tension between law and discretion, where sometimes the answer is clear, but sometimes not. I think we have continuing examples of people violating the law, and I'm very much opposed to riots. I'm very much opposed to the Capitol riot. I'm very much opposed to the riots that I understand are happening in Portland or Minneapolis or some other places. I'm a big believer in peaceful protest. I'm not in favor of violent protest and other forms of violence, and that is a constant threat to rule of law. Not so much, I think, a threat to the nation as a whole, but when you're a local businessman and your sense is you can't be protected by the police, or for that matter, when you're a Capitol staffer and you thought you're not being protected adequately by the police, that's not a rule of law situation. Likewise, there are constant debates about policing, right? And we've had those debates for a long time. On one hand, you want to make sure that police officers themselves follow the law. That is absolutely necessary. And you may want to limit their discretion in certain ways, because the discretion can be abused by race discrimination, but all sorts of other forms of discrimination, sex discrimination, and the like. On the other hand, you don't want to handicap the police officers too much, because if you do, then they will be unable to protect the citizens against criminals. And that's not rule of law either. If you aren't going to be beaten or shot by the police, that's wonderful. But if that materially increases your chance of being beaten and shot by criminals, that's not a great trade-off. You'd like to find a way of solving both problems. But I don't think these are new issues. I think this is something we've had to struggle with in various ways, because for a variety of reasons, sometimes lack of political will, sometimes lack of an obvious solution to some of the problems. I do think one thing that's interesting that people are just beginning to focus on is that we're beginning to think about rule of law in other contexts, like, for example, social media platforms. Obviously, the stakes there in many ways are a lot lower, because they're not going to beat anybody up. They're not going to shoot anyone. We don't rely on them to protect us against people beating us up or shooting us. On the other hand, if you're interested in, for example, effects on elections, you might wonder, to what extent should we worry about rule of law when it comes to Facebook or Twitter making decisions that might affect elections one way or another? Is that something we should say? No, there's a law, which is private property rights, which I'm a big supporter of, generally speaking. And it says that, Facebook, if Mark Zuckerberg wants to block certain things, or if Jack Dorsey wants to block certain things, his call. That's the law. That is the law today. Or should we be looking for more internal law? Just like Juan points out, that there is lots of important internal law in sporting leagues, even though they're not the government, even though they don't have power of life or death over us. But in order for them to fulfill their mission, there needs to be this internal law. People are beginning to ask what should be similar rules with regard to, say, very powerful social media platforms. So there are sometimes interesting and important new issues, but I think in many ways it's kind of an eternal problem, or at least one that's been around for many decades.
I hear you, but in your remarks, you did touch upon at least three things which have been very salient to many people in the past couple of years. Disturbance. I mean, rioting.
Right.
Police misconduct. The guardians of law and order
Right.
are themselves undermining law and order. That's two. And you just mentioned a third one, which is the problem of misinformation. If you're a democracy and you're dependent upon people registering their preferences through voting, and we assume that people are registering their preferences in some sort of rational way, what do we do if people are acting on the basis of manufactured misinformation? That was three big problems that confront the rule of law. Let me ask you this. One, what can you add to the list? Are there other things that have happened recently that make you, that add a bit of trepidation when you think about the rule of law?
Well, yes, it happened today. When I saw a woman who I don't agree with on a personal level, on anything politically, get removed from her office, leadership position, because she has the courage to tell the truth. I would love to debate Congresswoman Cheney on policy. Let's have that rigorous, thoughtful debate. But when we're debating facts, and when people in public office are being removed because of misinformation that the people that are removing them know is misinformation, it reminds me of what one of my mentors taught me. Just because you elect someone to public office does not give them courage. If they had no courage before they got elected, they won't have any courage when they're there. And unfortunately, we have a community of leaders in this country that are willing to publicly perpetuate a lie, misinformation that is baked into the cake. It's not just, oh, we know better. There are people in this country, and the polls and discussion groups around the country prove this, that really believe that our election was stolen. And so I go back to my analogy. Earlier this year, Tom Brady won his 7th Super Bowl. We all kind of agree that happened. If we start arguing that Tom Brady is not really a football player, he actually plays basketball, and there are people that actually believe that and believe that he never won a Super Bowl and he's never been in the NFL at all. He's been in the NBA playing for the Golden State Warriors his entire career. I mean, I sound ridiculous after a while. And at some point, when do you shut that nonsense down? We're not debating anymore who was better, Tom Brady or Peyton Manning. We're debating whether or not these were actually football players. That is a very dangerous place to be when we all know the truth, that they were football players. One's in the Hall of Fame, one will be when he retires.
Okay, well, I mean, your comment really does pick up on Eugene. Eugene talked about misinformation. You amped it up by talking about actually purposeful misinformation, political deception. Are there any?
It's called conscientious stupidity, going back to Dr. King. The two most dangerous things in our society, he's talked about this in his Strength to Love book. sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. There are people in this country, leadership in this country, that are conscientiously perpetuating stupidity. They know better, but they choose not to do better. It's very dangerous. I'm
Ellen,
sorry.
on the question of threats to the rule of law, what comes to your mind?
You know, Eugene and Juan covered all of my list. I want to kind of drive home, and I agree with you this time, Professor. I think that the divisions that can arise between people when, you know, alternative facts become a sort of a collective reality, that this presents an enormous challenge to the rule of law. If you can't agree on what's happening in the world, and this is really what Juan was saying, there's no way to agree how the law is going to be applied. You know, we have people believing that one of our political parties is actually a cabal of Satan worshiping pedophiles. You know, they actually believe that. So it's kind of difficult, you know, to imagine how you convince them that adhering to the rule of law is more important than destroying that cabal, right? So that kind of goes back, I think, to the spread of disinformation and bigotry on social media platforms. That's how we've gotten to this moment. You know, initially we knew about the speed of disinformation and bigotry. We didn't know about the precision with which these algorithms were going to work. And I'm very concerned about that. So that's probably my number one. And then, you know, the deployment of violence, of course, and intimidation in the service of political ends is huge. And that is something that many of us have been dealing with in the public square during the past months. And at least here in Oregon, it's still continuing.
Okay. Montrese, do you want to add something on this point?
I mean, I really think that Juan and Eugene and Ellen have summed it up nicely to get where we are and what the threats are to the rule of law. You know, I think I want to harken back. Ellen, in her remarks around defining the rule of law, mentioned this word trust and being able to trust in the rule of law being applied in a way that makes us want to comply and agree. And that's what I think is the biggest threat here. It's we're watching what's happening. Citizens are watching what's happening, watching the lies be told, and it is making it hard for us to trust in the rule of law and trust in the application of it in any sort of way that is equal or equitable. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in this country to sort of do some truth and reconciliation work. And until we actually do that work, I think we're going to be in this same boat.
Okay. In the title of our program, there is a clear desire for us to suggest some solutions. So I want to ask a question that aims in that direction. And here's my question. It's a hypothetical. You have been miraculously promoted. You and you alone are empowered to write about what will become the 28th Amendment to the United States Constitution. So I am promoting each person on this panel to being a founder. The amendment must begin with the words, quote, "In order to better secure the rule of law in the United States, ... Fill in the dots. In order to better secure the rule of law in the United States, what do? You've got the power. What do you say? Montrese, start us off.
I want to study the impact and effect of laws and get an evidence base to change them. We're human beings who've made these laws. And I think there's a level of studying how these laws impact population, how they're being enforced, who they're being enforced against, how they're being used, whether or not we're using discretionary law to direct a certain set of populations to drug court versus juvenile court, like studying the impact of laws and then making changes based on the findings, that evidence base. That's what I would say.
Okay. Ellen?
So this gives me a chance. Let me make sure I'm not on mute anymore. Okay, you can hear me, right?
We can hear you loud and clear.
Yes.
Gives me a chance to talk about the access to justice gap in America. It hasn't really come up yet, but it overarches the whole issue of the legitimacy of the rule of law for people who can't access a lawyer, can't access justice on a daily basis. There are well over 100 million Americans who live with civil justice problems, many involving basic human needs, like matters relating to their shelter, their sustenance, their safety, their health, yes, Montrese, and child custody issues. So I want to do something about that. And my amendment is going to make it possible finally to have civil justice. And it's going to say for all, and it is going to say, let's see, in order to better secure the rule of law in the United States, there is hereby declared a right to counsel in all civil matters involving basic human needs.
Wow. Will Gunn, I'm sure, is applauding.
I'm applauding too, Ellen. Yes.
And maybe we'll hear
Yes.
from him on this issue a bit later. But that's a striking proposal to the United States Constitution. Okay, Juan, you've got the floor. What would you put in as the 28th Amendment?
The basis of my amendment, again, comes from Dr. King's letter in the Birmingham jail, where he talks about unjust laws. And he says this: an unjust law is a code that the majority inflicts on a minority that is not binding on itself. My amendment would be real simple. Every law passed by Congress or a state legislature will first be applied to every member of that body. So if we go to war, every member of Congress, you got to send one of your kids first. We're gonna increase taxes. The first group that has to pay more taxes are the members of Congress who voted on that legislation. I think laws need to be applied to those who implement them. And I think you will often then get them to pause. And I also think this: if the government shuts down, they shouldn't get their paycheck.
Okay.
Until they fix it.
Okay. Eugene,
So
28th Amendment.
So I should say first, Juan's proposal sounds in many ways excellent. My gun rights friends, and of whom I have many, would be super delighted by that. That's a common argument they give against gun control laws, that our politicians may not carry guns themselves, but they're constantly protected by people who are paid lots of money to walk around armed. And for most of the rest of us, if we want that kind of protection, unless we extend Ellen's proposal that you get money not just for a lawyer, but you get money for a security guard too, you're your own first responder. So I think you might get a broad coalition for that. I don't really know the answer by any means, Randy, to your question. Here's one possibility, and it's a very much an upstream kind of issue. That might be that every child in the United States shall be entitled to have a scholarship in the amount that is, say, the average that's paid for public schooling in the US. And the parents could then decide whether to send the child to a public school or to a private school or religious school or secular school or whatever else. It's not going to directly solve the rule of law problems. I think it'll solve a lot of equality problems. And I think it'll solve a lot of the lack of civic education problems. In some respects, it may actually cause somewhat more social fracturing because parents will be able to say, I want my kids raised the way I want them and not the way the school board or the majority wants them. But I think on balance, it would make for better education. I think better education is the key to a better future in a lot of ways. One way of thinking about it is we do try to protect people's needs by, for example, giving them food stamps. But imagine a world in which poor people had food stamps, but they could only use them in government-run food stores. My guess is that wouldn't be a great world. I think in many ways we like the fact that you can use your food stamps, which are paid for by the taxpayers, but you can use them at a wide range of privately run stores, which are competing with each other and which are harnessing all of the advantages of competition. I would like to see, generally speaking, our public schools, or excuse me, our K through 12 schooling run the same way, on a model of competition and a model of school choice, which I think will help both civics education and other education and help level the playing field in many ways for the children that graduate from those schools. So I'm not at all sure this is the right answer, but if I had to guess to gamble on one thing, that would be the gamble I would take.
I have still more questions, but before I go to any more, does anybody want to say anything more about this question that I just posed? That is to say, if you had your shot, I mean, somebody comes up to you and says, you know, at this moment, you have the power, you can put in one thing, just one, to make our country a better country under the rule of law. You've heard your colleagues. Is there anything that you would add? This is your shot.
This is controversial, Professor, but I would add we need to change how we elect our public officials.
Okay.
The role that money plays in politics and gerrymandering is why so many people in public office don't have the courage to do what they know, I believe, is right. I believe a lot of good people run for office, and a lot of people who are willing to make good decisions don't run for office because of the money and just the vitriol, if you will, that is found in our political systems that continue to keep us divided.
Others?
If I could just say that it takes a heck of a long time to get a constitutional amendment. So I'm going to say that in terms of trying to preserve the rule of law and the trust and confidence in the people, is we really need to convince people that it's valuable. We need to have sessions like this. We need to have civics education. We have a bill at my legislature, Senate Bill 513. It's not going to go in the Constitution, but it's going to require civics education because only 24% of high school seniors test at or above proficiency in civics education. So I appreciate the question, but I just think, you know, look at the Equal Rights Amendment. Do we really want to wait, or do we need to do something now?
Okay. Okay. Others? All right. No, Montrese, go ahead.
I really would love to find a way to make it so that we all have to take some true embedded, implicit, unconscious, even conscious bias training. I mean, I just feel like there's something to be said about the fact that all these systems and this rule of law is run by human beings, that because we're breathing, we're biased. I'm not going to call anybody racist, and we can talk about our racist systems and structures, but if we're breathing, we're biased. And some of us are in positions to really impact people's lives and livelihood forever and ever in generations to come, in healthcare and public health, in the legislature, in law, in every field. And that might be a soft touch, but by golly, there's just something there. There's something there for sure.
Okay. Listen, all of you are lawyers. We've got a very diverse panel. You're coming at it in very different ways. You've had very interesting, very distinguished careers, but you know, you've been in the law in very different positions. My question to each of you is, are lawyers conducting themselves as good ambassadors for the rule of law? Do you think lawyers have, just in your experience, and reading the newspaper, interacting with your colleagues, do you think that lawyers are being good ambassadors? And if not, what changes need to be made in the expectations that govern lawyers? So those are two questions I'd like to put on the table. And Montrese, start us off.
When I think of an ambassador, I think of someone who trusts the cause, believes in the cause, advocates for the cause. And in many instances, when again, the rule of law is not applied in an equitable manner, and we see that regularly, it becomes very hard to be an ambassador in that way. In my coaching work, in my work with students, I encourage them to go to law school because we need to see more people of color in law. But I also have to warn them that, particularly women of color, that we're still 2% of the field of law, women of color in the legal field. And there are the microaggressions and the biases that you're going to have to deal with in the law that will impact your career on a regular basis. I have these conversations all the time. And so I think in order for us to be better ambassadors, I'm going to go back to what I always go back to is the law itself needs to do a better job of instilling trust in the rule of law by ensuring we've got some equal application. It's just not happening, and it's hard to be an ambassador in those kind of situations.
Okay, I want to press you on this though. Fine, but again, my question is, do you think that the lawyers with whom you interact, as a general matter, are conducting themselves in a
Yes.
way that should, that inculcates respect for and generates the sort the good sort of the sort of feeling that people should have about
Yes.
legality,
Yes.
about the
Because
legal
I work with
system?
public health lawyers. Because I
Okay.
work with public health lawyers, absolutely. People who literally are committed to using the law as a tool to advance population health, that are
Yeah.
committed to looking at equity and finding ways to center underrepresented voices, disenfranchised people. We are recognizing as lawyers now how there's an opportunity here in the politicization of public health for us to really change the way the system structures. But we've got a lot of work to do. I mean, clearly, but the people that I work with, yes, the public health lawyers, I think are good ambassadors for the field of law and for using, for leveraging law as the tool that it should be to advance population health and improve health outcomes. But we need to study what's happening with that. The other piece of it is we can see certain communities have the same laws on the books, but they have 12 and 15-year difference in life expectancy within a 3-mile difference. And a lot of that has to do with enforcement, inequitable enforcement. They've got the same laws in the books, they're just not being applied. So they may have the same housing laws, great housing laws, to protect against substandard housing. But if they're not being implemented or applied equally, you're going to see health impacts. And then, there's a whole conversation around law as a social determinant of health. Law undergirds every single social determinant of health out there: education, income, transportation, the built environment. Law itself is a social determinant of health. And those of us that are public health lawyers are leaning into that a heck of a lot more in this era.
Okay. I'm glad that ultimately you suggested that at least some of your lawyer colleagues are being good ambassadors. And here I've been asking questions. I haven't jumped in, but right now I am going to jump in for a minute. I feel really strong. There's a big thing with me. I mean, I don't think that lawyers should feel embarrassed about expressing their admiration for other lawyers who are upholding the values that we are talking about. I suppose that one of the reasons why I guess I feel this so intensely is because some of the people whom I most admire in my life have been lawyers. I think first and foremost of my former boss, Mr. Civil Rights, the great Thurgood Marshall, who, as time goes on, I revere him more. But not just Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, or if we go back further, amongst the great abolitionists, Wendell Phillips. And in our own time, I think that we do see people who are lawyers. A few years ago, I thought it was absolutely extraordinary. When the curtains came down and the rules were changed, and there were people that were coming from abroad and they didn't know what was going to happen to them, and lawyers took out for the airports with signs. I'm available. I will help. They weren't asking for any money. They weren't asking for anything. They were just out there. It seemed to me that that was a great day for the rule of law. And frankly, I felt very proud to be a lawyer. And I think that people who do things like that, and I would include, by the way, the person who started us off, I would include Will Gunn in that procession. And I think as lawyers, we need to be critical about other lawyers who are falling down on the job. True enough, we need to be self-critical. We don't need to be complacent. But we also need to be willing, it seems to me, to applaud those who really do make our profession proud. All right, enough of the sermon. I'm going to ask Juan, what do you think about, so you're in private law practice. You're in private law practice. Amongst your colleagues, are people being good ambassadors for the rule of law?
I'm going to be very honest with you. I think in private practice, the majority of my private practice colleagues get up every day trying to represent their client or their clients. And in private practice, you used the word for the first time today, but we don't talk about it much in the legal context. It's an economic, money-driven conversation. No one's trying to break the rules. No one's trying to be, unethical. But at the end of the day, when you're in private practice, you're trying to do what's best for your client, and you're trying to make money. And there's a business aspect of that oftentimes does not allow private attorneys to be active in the advocacy of these more social justice, progressive issues. They may have private passions. They may find, and I'm one of them, who finds ways to be engaged through the bar associations, through church, through other civic organizations. But I think the day-to-day practice of law oftentimes precludes private attorneys from being the ambassador, other than being that ambassador in the context of the practice, being a person of integrity, being honest, working collaboratively with opposing counsel, things of that nature, being respectful of the judge.
Basically, the ethics rules, right?
Yes,
the ethics rules, right?
The ethics rules. That's what's important. Of course, my phone rings now. Following those ethics rules, I think that's where a lot of private practitioners on a day-to-day basis fall. And I'll just, end at this point. I'm very committed to these issues, but I have to carve out time to do that work. I could spend all day, every day, billing, working a case because of the nature of my practice. And many of my private practice lawyers, particularly in corporate firms, that's where they are most of the time. And it's very difficult to be that ambassador outside of that context that I already described.
Can I push back on you a little bit?
Please.
A few years ago, I had, people, you go to a lawyer and you make out a will. And you think that, gosh, I'm not gonna revisit this for a long, long, long time. It's not real to you.
Right.
Well, unfortunately, I had to revisit the will much sooner than I had ever imagined. I go to my lawyer, private practitioner, not on the front pages. My lawyer had done her job extremely well. At this moment of tremendous vulnerability to me, she was supremely competent. She was thoroughly feeling. She did her job extremely well. In my view, that's a tremendous contribution to society. What about that? Am I being sentimental? What do you think?
I would never criticize you. But I do think in that context, Professor Kennedy, your lawyer values the attorney-client relationship. That may be your client's personal nature. I mean, I will tell you, I have clients that I know personally, that I've gone the extra mile for, that I have done work for them beyond, above and beyond, that I hope would respond to me as you respond to your lawyer. But I will say, and I don't mean to be cynical, I will always do what I have to do to help a paying client. And I underline paying client. And I'm not
Sounds like
saying that
she's got good customer service skills to me. You know?
right. And again, that does not mean I don't do pro bono work. I'm not willing to serve the community. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying that the nature of the private practice attorney, and what I wish law schools would talk more about for law students, is the business of law.
Okay.
Yes, I would love to spend all day, quote, fighting for justice. But my managing partner has a billable hour requirement that I have to meet.
Okay. Listen, we have just a few minutes remaining. I want to make sure that we give our convener, Will Gunn, a final shot. Before I ask him to come on, I would just like to say that the time has shot by, as they say. I'd like to thank each of you for your responses to the questions. These are questions that are not going away. And I want to say that it was a pleasure talking with you and meeting with you. And I wish each of you all the best. Will, you've got 2 minutes. Use them.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Kennedy. Greatly appreciate it. And it was just a profound reminder of why I enjoyed your class so much all those years ago. I also want to take this opportunity to thank all of our panelists for your remarks today, for your thought-provoking comments. You gave me a lot to think about, and I know that you did for our attendees as well. Wish we would have more time for you all today, but we have to close this out at some point. Since this is, I want to make just 2 points. One, please go to lawday.org to discover more about resources that are available for Law Day. It continues, and this discussion on advancing the rule of law now is not one that's limited to a day or week, months. It's something that we need to continue to reflect upon. But the final thing that I'd like to do today is just publicly thank the members of the staff that have brought this all together. Frank Valadez and Tiffany Middleton from the ABA Division for Public Education. They've done a phenomenal job. All the talk about civics education, that is critical. I remember Schoolhouse Rock and how to pass a bill and just the impact that had on me. It was simple, it was easy to use. And I am concerned that so many Americans today don't have the fundamentals about how our system works. We have a lot of work to do to advance the rule of law now. Thanks, everyone. We appreciate your involvement. We appreciate you being here. Have a great day.